Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to talk about imperialism, and we are going to understand what imperialism really is, and it has been available in different forms in different periods, and it has existed for centuries, and it still exists in the world, and it has different forms. It has different it is there are different definitions and there are different types of imperialism, and we have to see that, and we are specifically going to talk about the 19th century imperialism, and we are also going to analyze how it impacts today's world in the 21st century. Without further ado, let's uh, talk to Mr. John Kofas. Let's welcome Mr. Jon V. Kofas, and he's going to discuss what is imperialism, and he's going to tell us a brief definition of imperialism, and then he's going to uh, analyze how the 19th century imperialism impacts the 21st century world today. How are you, sir?
Good evening, Assad. Good evening, everyone. This is a very important topic. One reason is because when the Cold War was over by 1990, and then President George W. Bush in the United States announced that there is a new world order that emerged. There were uh, people, scholars namely, who believed that that this new world order would necessarily entail one capitalist world economy that would geographically encompass the entire world, whereas that did not exist, obviously, before the collapse of the communist bloc and coincidentally the simultaneous decision of China to become increasingly integrated into the capitalist world economy, although China kept the Communist Party one party state, which of course exists to this day. So, having said that, throughout the Western world, there was in the 1990s an enormous celebration, and there was a sense by Western journalists, politicians, and scholars that the West won the Cold War, that the West, in fact, was triumphant, that the West was vindicated, pursuing a Cold War from the Truman presidency and the establishment of NATO in the late until George W. Bush, which, of course, it was his presidency under which a new world order, which meant, by the way, new world order meant that the United States was now the sole superpower. The Soviet Union had broken up into the various republics, and there was now the Russian Federation, which is still in existence today. Soviet republics became independent countries integrated into the world capitalist economy. The definition of the New World Order was rather deceptive insofar as those who celebrated it and projected it to the public wanted the public to assume that the triumph of the Western victory over the Soviet bloc and the so-called winning of the Cold War necessarily entailed that there was a victory for democracy, when in fact the victory was for the capitalist world system, the capitalist world economy, at the time under the embryonic stage of neoliberalism, the embryonic phase of neoliberalism, by the way, which started in the 1980s and it continued to accelerate in the 1990s. Now, neoliberalism in the 1990s began to integrate very rapidly and aggressively the world economy. Hence the term, many people who are old enough like me may remember the term globalization became part of the conversation in political circles and in journalism, and soon enough everybody was talking about globalization, that the economy was globalized. The fact is the world economy was always global. The capitalist world economy, because capitalism is not like the feudal manorial system, which is locally based, and it's not nation state based. All it is, capital is international. It was always global. Investors always invested from out to the rest of the world, and that investment entail that governments who support capitalists who made those investments and were interested in global expansion of capitalism. And this meant that the government had to have the means to support global expansion. Therein rests the need. So we have from the 15th century expansion down toward Northwest Africa, onward to the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and so forth, is the Northwest Europeans first. It started with the Portuguese and the Spaniards. They were, in fact, the first to, in the 16th century, to undertake enormous voyages of exploration for the purpose of colonizing and securing markets and colonies. And of course, Spain was famous for its armada, the naval force that it had, until it was, of course, defeated and it began to decline, defeated by the British. And so what we have is the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, starting colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, by the way, because when they could not find raw materials, they took the next best thing, people, and they traded in people, free labor, slave labor. And that continued, intensified, in fact, under the British and the French. They were very aggressive in the transatlantic slave trade, and the transatlantic slave trade was connected to colonialism, control, that is, governments set up by the Northwest Europeans, the British, the French, the Dutch, in Africa, in Latin America, and that Latin America exports, by the way, because the Portuguese and the Spaniards conquered Latin America. So they speak those languages. And so they established colonial governments, which you're not going to get decolonization, that is free sovereign governments in Latin America until the 19th century. You have a structure on a world in from the 15th century onward to the 19th century, when the United States in the late 19th century joins the imperialist countries of Northwest Europe, as well as Japan right after the United States. So this is basically an overview of imperialism. Today, what I want to do is discuss a couple of my early projects when I was in Chicago program, and in the 1970s, in the late 1970s. And I was, of course, influenced. I lived in the 1970s was a transition period from the old social welfare Keynesian state in the United States to the neoliberal corporate welfare state that has existed ever since. This was a transition period. The 1970s molded my thinking. It was a decade of rapid change, a tumultuous decade. The Vietnam War defined not just the United States, but East-West relations. The Vietnam War created, to some degree, the Sino-Soviet split. Certainly by 1973, was actually before that. The signs were all over that it was before that. The United States war in Vietnam had expanded over to Cambodia and Laos with illegal bombings of Cambodia and Laos. At the same time, the United States, the CIA, was involved in a number of countries overthrowing governments. The most infamous case, of course, was Chile in 1973 with the overthrow of Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende was duly elected. He was a socialist. He decried imperialism, American imperialism, and tried to argue that the country's economy was under foreign control and more national control, greater national sovereignty was needed, and social development. He was overthrown and replaced with the help of the CIA, and replaced by a military dictator that the US, of course, approved. In 1973, the dictator was General Augusto Pinochet, and he was the individual under whose regime neoliberalism became an experiment. In the 1970s, besides this event, there were others that molded my thinking and my decision to choose the first two projects that I chose, the first two books that I chose to write. One was my dissertation, later published as a book, and then a follow-up to that. And one of the things was the economic hegemony or dominance of the core countries within the capitalist system over the entire global South, and the quest to achieve that sort of hegemony through any means, including overthrowing governments. When I left Greece as an immigrant, as I was a child, I was 12 years old, in 1966, I mean, I had no idea I was involved in politics, but the year after that, the CIA helped to overthrow the government in that country, and installed a dictatorship. The CIA and the United States were also supporting a military junta, a dictatorship in Portugal, as well as in Spain. So Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, all under dictatorships backed by the United States and integrated into the Northwest European and US economies. This was not colonialism, but it was a very subtle form of imperialism. No one had any doubts who was behind, because no one, it was no secret, considering the United States had NATO bases in these countries, and their ships were there, and they had military bases. So there was no doubt at all. And now, even if people want to research this, and even if they go to the CIA archives as well as State Department declassified documents, they will see that, in fact, this was the case. Although at the time, I want to emphasize, at the time, of course, there was complete denial of this, that there was any involvement. Now there is no denial, and the evidence is abundant. The CIA was involved in neighboring Turkey, in Turkish politics, in Cyprus, and of course the Middle East. In the 1970s, the situation in the Middle East exploded. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 was an example of that. The OPEC reaction, the Arab countries with the leverage of oil began to raise prices. They reacted very negatively to what was happening, to what Israel was doing with the Palestinians. And amid this turmoil, the US loses Vietnam. It finally comes to the realization there's no way to win. And in 1975, the fall of Saigon means the end of the US attempt to make sure that Vietnam does not become communist. It became Ho Chi Minh's group, the North Vietnam, prevailed. And this was a horrible blow politically and globally to the United States, because the coincidence of the fall of Saigon in the mid 1970s takes place against the background of Ireland, of Northern Ireland's rebel group, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, against British imperialism, and in Africa, the Black South Africans demanding majority rights, because the majority population, of course, is Black. They're Africans. But the tiny white minority controlled all of the institutions and most of the money. So the Blacks in their own land were workers for the white elite. And so in South Africa, they begin to demand rights for Blacks, and eventually they would, of course, call for a boycott of apartheid South Africa. This convergence was a blow, not just to the United States, but to the collective imperialist West, These are the developments that were happening when I was in Chicago, in addition to the fact that in the 1970s, when I was a PhD student, there was the Black Panther movement, which was a civil rights movement, but believed in much stronger action than just rhetoric, working within the system to reform the system. The feminist movement was beginning. there were major scandals, political scandals. The Watergate, which forced Nixon to leave office, erupted, and this was this was some of what was happening in 1976. The U.S. was always looking to distract. In 1976, the CIA again became the government of Argentina, installing a military dictatorship there. 2 years later, the Iranians rebelled against the Shah of Iran, whom they regarded as a puppet serving US imperialist interests, namely the most precious commodity that Iran had, of course, was oil, and Iran was tied to the US and Israel under the Shah of Iran. So the Iranian Revolution in early 1970, late 78, early 1979 was a huge blow to the Jimmy Carter administration. Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States, and a blow to the West. They were hoping that there would be some kind of a regime after the Shah that would still be pro-West and subservient to the West, simply because it wasn't the left. Iran, by the way, at the time had the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party it's called, but they supported the revolution, but they didn't prevail. It was the Islamists, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who took over and formed a government that was not that was not that was not a pro-Western government. It wasn't necessarily a government that was it wasn't necessarily a government that was pro-Soviet at all, by the way, because this was a religious government, but it was a government that was very hostile to the West and to Israel. The Iranian Revolution, I want to make sure the audience people understand this, is the genesis of the anti-Islamic movement. I lived in the United States at the time, and I remember how insulting people found it that how dare Iran do this. They wouldn't even consider the possibility of the Iranian people having the right to national sovereignty, popular sovereignty. If the American people have the right to popular sovereignty, the right to have their own government, why deny it to the Iranians? If they want to have the Ayatollah Khomeini, that's their issue. That's a political issue. That is an issue to be solved within Iran. And so one of the arguments was that this is the genesis of the Western Islamophobia movement, and it became a movement, and it remains to this day. Iran was the start. Iran was a shock because they lost a satellite, an economic satellite, and a political satellite serving U.S. and Western interests. 79, by the way, was the year I received my PhD. I had started teaching in 78. They gave me a position, so I started teaching in 78. But I remember we had academic conferences to discuss this, and there were very intense feelings on this issue, as though Iran had just invaded the United States. And I was thinking, wait a minute. Really, this is a national issue to be solved and to be dealt with by the people there. If they're depriving U.S. corporations, and of course there were, of course, U.S. corporations, which had contracts, they had long-term leases for oil. Okay, fine. That is another issue, but to subjugate an entire country to secure the leases. That is the essence of imperialism right there. And the US didn't have to colonize. I mean, the cheapest form of imperialism is not with colonization. Colonization costs money, by the way. You know, what the British did in India, that was very costly in so many respects. The cheapest way is to have this sort of imperialism, get all the benefits, and you let them pay for the bureaucratic network. They have the police, the military, they pay for everything, the people there. But that is the genesis of the Islamic movement. When I was, this is the environment that molded me at the time. You're not aware, you know, you live through these times, and we're all subject to the conditioning by our environment. We can't possibly escape that. There are scholars throughout history we have argued, oh yeah, we can transcend. No, you can't. And nor should we transcend, by the way, the times we live in and the environment. We should be immersed in it and try to do the best we can in terms of offering something constructive. When I was asked by my dissertation director and the committee to do a project, they said, what do you want to do? And I chose, given this background that I've given, I said, how about something on nationalism? Because I was seeing intense nationalism on a world scale, and they said, no, don't do nationalism. Way too much, too big of a topic. You'll get lost. And I settled on doing a dissertation, which later became a monograph, a short book on the role of Greece and the great powers in the Crimean War. And the Crimea, of course, is something that has relevance to this day. Obviously, there is a Ukrainian war to this day. There is a war right now over the Black Sea. Many people, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, I think I have in a previous video. The goal of the United States, the West, the collective West, is to have easy access through the Black Sea, the Transcaucasus region, and out towards Central Asia, so they can easily impose a containment policy against both China and Russia by having access to those republics through the Transcaucasus and Central Asia, and the two lesser countries, North Korea and Iran, of course. So they would kill four birds with one stone by having the kind of, and this is one of the goals for this war. The Crimea, when I did the book on dissertation, which later became a book on the Crimean War, the war, in many respects, the era of imperialism, and I'm not hardly the first one to mention this, by the way, other scholars have dealt with this issue, that the world we live in today is much more resembles the era of new imperialism from 1870 to 1914, because there isn't one world power like the superpower that Bush announced in 1990. We have one new world order. Well, though actually there are many power centers. Clearly, we see this with the rise of China. I want to mention that the Crimea, and give this as an example and see how parallels are between that and what's going on today. Both the Russian government, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas the First, who died during the war, by the way, his successor was Tsar Alexander II. both Nicholas and Alexander used the pretext of protecting the Christian Orthodox subjects of the Balkans and the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, because Mother Russia, the Russian Empire, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, had given itself the role of successor to the Byzantine Empire. We are going to protect the Christians, the Orthodox Christians, by the way, Eastern Europe, Balkans, I should say, up to Russia up there. This is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The West is Catholic, obviously. So the argument was, we're going to protect. Now, obviously, that was a pretext. Russia wanted to have dominance, military dominance in the Black Sea and in the Balkans, and used Greece because of its geographical location, and also because during the Crimean War of 1854-56, the king of Greece at the time, who was actually not Greek, he was Bavarian, he was an import, was pro-Russian. However, the country at the time, in the mid-19th century, was heavily dependent economically and militarily on France and Britain. And France and Britain had naval presence here, and the trade of the country, the economy of the country depended on them. So there was a war between Russia, France, and Britain. The French, by the way, used the exact same argument as the Russians. We want to protect the Catholics of the Middle East and the eastern part of Europe and so forth. So both sides used the argument of religion, when in fact that had nothing to do with the real goal, which was imperialism, by the way. That's what they were after. The other thing is that the French were primarily partners with the British. However, and this has relevance today, because a lot of people assume just because countries are allies, they're still not rivals. They are rivals. And we see it between Germany and the United States right now, today, or Germany and France, and so forth. France and Britain at the time, although they were partners because they agreed that Russia was a greater enemy, must be defeated, must be prevented during the Crimean War, they actually had a lot of rivalries, and they were trying to compete for markets in the Middle East. This was key. Greece, the Ottoman Empire were key areas, strategic areas. Obviously, France and Britain prevailed, but they were wise enough, unlike some of the leadership we have today, to recognize that the Paris Peace Treaty, that they cannot possibly lock the Russians out of the Black Sea. The only thing they demanded is that Russia does not militarize the Black Sea, so that it uses the military. They knew it had nothing to do with protecting Christian subjects, so that it doesn't use the Black Sea as a military outpost for hitting pro-Western satellites in this part of the world, in the Balkans and the Middle East. Now, as soon as they signed that treaty in Paris to end that war, they started another war. It's called the Second Opium War in China. The first Opium War was in 1838, and it was the reason it's called Opium War. It's because the British East India Company demanded that the Chinese open ports and markets to buy opium, which they were getting from the Indian subcontinent and selling it to the Chinese. The first Opium War was a success, and it was the beginning of the decline of the Chinese Empire in 1838. The Second Opium War that started in 1856, was also a success because China was forced to open more ports. And it was during that war, by the way, for those people who have some uh, 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 knowledge of what happened with the French in Indochina, that the French began to look at Indochina, and that was when they established a foothold in Indochina, French colonization in Indochina. So they went from the war in the Crimea to a war in China, all of it for markets and military hegemony. It was nonstop. I'm mentioning this, by the way, because today there is in journalism and in popular, social media and so forth, and the political discussion, the so-called the Western forever war doctrine, just war, 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 militarized to the teeth, whether it's Japan, NATO countries, the US. And the fact is that under imperialism, the forever war was a given because it was a way to secure markets. Now, uh, between them, the country, and again, I bring up France and England because they were partners, of course, in the Opium War as they were in the Crimea. And the reason I bring them up is because while they were partners, they were also rivals. They were also rivals. And that rivalry intensified when Germany was unified in 1870 and Germany rapidly industrialized, surprising all of Europe, by the way, the world, very rapid industrialization. And industrialization, by the way, gave them the means to militarize very rapidly. And on the basis of that, the German elites argued that they had the right to imperialism and to colonies. They argued, where, I'm going to put it very plainly, where is my cut? They demanded, those who have studied the history of Africa know that there is a period in the late 19th century called the partition of Africa. The Europeans basically drew up the map of Africa. They were dividing Africa amongst themselves like, pieces of cake. And Germany was the newcomer of that. And they would do the exact same thing. The map of in the Middle East, the map of the Middle East was drawn up by the Europeans. They determined the borders. They determined the map of the Middle East. And all of this is under the heading of imperialism. I'm going to stop there and ask if you have any questions because I've been talking too long.
It's your signature line now. Mr. Kopus, well, there is one important thing that we need to differentiate is between imperialism and colonialism, because these terms do sound too similar. Colonialism is also the same thing, that you are extending your geographical boundaries and you are trying to occupy other states by many means, and the same goes for imperialism. So how can we differentiate between these two terms?
Yes, colonialism, what happens with colonialism is the European governments, the United States only had one formal colony, the Philippines. They establish a colonial government. They have a colonial governor, whether it's in Egypt or India or in one of the African countries, by the way. They have a military, colonial military there. They have a police force. The officers, whether it was in India or in Africa, were invariably from the mother country. They were white. The soldiers were the indigenous population. The high-level positions, the judicial system, for example, the judges were from the mother country, back home, from Europe. They determine the justice system. The criminal justice system was in their hands, and it was set up to serve colonial interests. So colonialism is an entire bureaucratic system that was transformed to the colonized country, whether it was Algeria by the French, Nigeria by the English, and so forth, whether it was Tanganyika by the Germans. The idea was to have European, and in the case of the United States, of course, American. In the case of the United States and the Philippines, European officials run the major institutions, and their goal was not to serve the interests of the indigenous population, but of the companies of the colonial power. Now, imperialism doesn't require any of the bureaucratic structure, whether it's the judicial system or the police or the military or the colonial government, none of that. The indigenous population takes has control of the government. However, it is beholden to a core capitalist country, whether it's Britain, the United States, like I said, Germany, France, Holland. So the imperialist system is a system where there is no colonial bureaucracy, no colonial governance. Now, imperialism, I'm going to bring up one of my favorite authors, Chinua Achebe, in Africa, an African who became famous with the book he wrote called Things Fall Apart, where basically he decries the imperialism of the Europeans, where they come in and they erase gradually the local customs, the local culture, the local religion. Everything becomes European. There are missionaries that try to convert the local population to Christianity. There are merchants selling the indigenous population European clothing, so the traditional clothing goes out the window. I think I might have mentioned this before. Mahatma Gandhi pointed out that if you want to kick the British out, stop buying whatever they're selling. Buy stuff, buy anything that your fellow Indians are making. Don't buy whatever they're selling. Their factories are doing well in Liverpool and Manchester and in London because you're buying their products, and that keeps imperialism going. So imperialism impacts everything from culture to religion, which is part of the culture, by the way, language, education institutions, the military. All institutions are impacted. The police, the criminal justice system, all institutions are impacted by imperialism, and those institutions were designed to serve the country where the global south, and this, by the way, it's no different in Latin America. I should mention something about Latin America. The fact is, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, let's not forget Mexico. Mexico were not colonized, they were free countries in the 19th century. However, their economies were inexorably linked to the core of the capitalist system, to the core countries, namely the United States, Canada, Northwest Europe. Okay, so they were not serving the interests of the population in each given society. They were serving foreign capitalist interests. Even the infrastructure, I'm mentioning this because China has been criticized for building infrastructure, for getting heavily into infrastructural development in Asia and in Africa and investing heavily. But China is doing so, by the way, if you compare the infrastructural development of China today, right now, and in the last decade and a half or so, what you'll see is that the infrastructure that they're developing is intended not only to serve Chinese trade with the country where they're building the infrastructure. Iran, for example, is one of the countries that China has invested heavily in building the infrastructure, but so is Mexico. They're investing everywhere, in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. But the infrastructure there is designed to serve the population as well as to stimulate trade with China. This is not to say that China is made up of angels and they're just doing this for humanitarian reasons. Not at all. They're in business. They're trying to make money and expand economically. But when you compare that infrastructure with, for example, let's take Chile. It's a country about which I have written a couple of books. When you look at the infrastructure of Chile, Chile is this elongated country geographically along the Pacific. When you look at the country, the geography of the country, you would think that civil engineers would build roads that go north to south to serve the population all across the major towns and cities and villages of Chile. Well, they don't. The infrastructure was roads, railroads were all going from the mines and the farms right to the ports so that they can export raw materials. Chile, a major agriculture and a major mining country, by the way. So they were going from the farms and the mines to the ports. Ships picked up the raw materials and transported them to the United States and Northwest Europe. So the infrastructure was built to accommodate not the Chilean economy, but the economy of Northwest Europe and the United States and Canada. So that is a clear-cut example of what imperialism entails. It again, just geography. When you look at the geography of Chile, it's absurd that they would not have roads going north to south. Rather, they had roads going east to west, because that's what suited the commercial interests of the Europeans, the United States. So the situation here is one where we see imperialism at work. Another area is the financial control. And that was my second book that I wrote in the late 1970s, and I completed it and it was published in 1980. And that financial control is controversial, and it ties in with what's going on today. Um, the Europeans and the United States used loans as a means of financial control throughout the global south and the periphery countries. My second book dealt with the financial control of the Europe of Northwest Europe in Greece. I used Greece as an example. Later, of course, I veered off toward Latin America using Chile, Colombia, Peru, and those countries. But in 1980, the first book that I did on financial control was Greece. Now, financial control is again criticized today because China is being accused of using loans as leverage for financial control of the global south. And China is used as an example of a country that manipulates the BRICS group, of which China, of course, is the largest member, and uses the BRICS group to enhance Chinese economic development and to uh, strengthen its own economy. Um, China, China's economic, financial development and economic development is inexorably intertwined with partner countries. And clearly, I want to make sure that the audience understands, people understand that China is looking after itself. China is interested in becoming even more powerful economically on a world scale than it already is, by the way. And it is number one in purchasing power parity in the world, much richer than the US. You not value GDP, but just power parity. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, the fact is that the Europeans and the United States later, of course, by the early 20th century, used loans as a hook to control the market share of the countries where um, they were going into, whether in the case of the United States, but also Europe. Before the United States, it was Europe that controlled the markets of Latin America. Then eventually, of course, the United States stepped in and replaced, especially after World War I, the US replaced, after the Spanish-American War, really, of 1898, gradually the United States began replacing the Europeans. And certainly after World War I, very rapidly, the US began to replace the Europeans in Mexico and Central America, and then down to South America. Loans, when I wrote the book on Greece, I discovered that there was no greater tragedy than these loans that the great powers were using to hook these countries, because the loans left these countries perpetually in debt. I mean, perpetually. Those loans took many decades to be paid off. For one thing, the charges for fees and various services were taken from the loan itself up front by the country lending the money. And then there was there was a linkage. The country making the loan, whether it was Britain and France, in the case of Greece, for example. These same countries, by the way, made loans to the Ottoman Empire and to China. And I'll bring up the Chinese case because it's very interesting. They use these loans, they use linkage in these loans. In other words, you're going to borrow from us, but you not only have to trade with us, buy the products, sell the raw materials, but they dictated trade policy, and they dictated the terms of trade. This is a very important component. Um, they also this also meant that it precluded national economic development because it became a dependency relationship in which the countries borrowing were hooked into. They had perpetual balance of payments deficits. And to make up the gap, the money that they lacked, the fact is that they borrowed even more. So the debt issue was a continuous one. I want to mention China because during the Boxers' Rebellion in 1899, 1901, the Europeans, the United States, as well as Japan and Russia, by the way, sent troops to China to suppress a group of Chinese nationalists known as Boxers. These were people who wanted the end of foreign exploitation of China. They wanted the end of the opium trade, which had weakened the population basically of China, especially in the agricultural sector. China was not industrialized. It was still an agrarian economy. And they rebelled. And so the Europeans, Japan and Russia, and the United States sent in troops to China. Then they gave them the bill for what it cost. They gave the government in Beijing the bill for what it cost to put down the rebellion. The Chinese government said, well, we don't have that kind of money to give you. They said, no problem, we will loan it to you. And the way you pay us back is we take over your custom houses. And the earnings from the custom houses are going to pay for the interest of the loans. This was a form of financial control. This was one form of financial control. The other was they forced them to trade with these countries. These countries, of course, became very aggressive, and they were rivals, especially Russia and Japan. The Boxers' Rebellion led to an intense rivalry over China between Russia and Japan, and those two countries had a war in 1904, 1905, which Japan won again. But you can see how imperialism, even with countries that cooperate in one area, leads to war in another. And this war came right after the Boer War in South Africa, which was essentially behind that war was Great Britain and Germany. And between the Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War, you have the prelude to World War. And both of those wars were wars of imperialism. And the reason I'm what we have is essentially a situation where which some parallel the aggressive imperialist policies do not necessarily end well. They just because countries are allied toward a single goal, or in one instance, does not mean that they have common ground and common goals and see eye to eye in another instance. And these examples illustrate as much. I want to end it there. I think that we have today, I want to make some concluding remarks. I think we have today in the world a situation where militarism as a means of resolving conflict, which conflict is undertaken in order to achieve geoeconomic goals. So the geopolitical conflict on the surface appears to be about the balance of power, when in fact the goals in the neoliberal era, just as the goals in the age of new imperialism, 1870 to 1914, are really economic. Economic exploitation was a very important component. I'm not going to state categorically that it was the single component, obviously, but it was a very important component. There were other components. There were clearly the countries wanted to make sure that they had markets in the global south because their factories back home were dependent on securing raw materials, and without those markets they couldn't keep those factories going, and they wanted to make sure that those raw materials were kept, the price of raw materials were kept at low prices. Now this is really continuing today. When Niger asked the French to leave, the world found out that France was exploiting uranium and buying it for a few dollars, $5, $6 a kilo, when in fact uranium in the international market at the wholesale level, of course, is sold at 200 plus, 200 to 400. And this was a clear-cut case. This is just recently. This was a very clear-cut case. And it's in the 21st century of how economic exploitation was taking place between a core country, France, a major European, and one of the G7 countries, and a global south country, Niger, a small African country, whose most important raw material export happened to be uranium, and the French were essentially exploiting it and exploiting the labor of Niger for a tiny, tiny fraction of its value in the world market. I want to end the discussion by noting that imperialism, and today under neoliberalism, is very dangerous because it leads to conflict. The worst, of course, in the history of the last 150 years or so, was that the wars of imperialism and the competition, the imperialist competition from 1870 to 1914, exploded in World War I. And there is concern by many people around the world who seriously reflect on this matter and are concerned about where we're going. And today, the world is very different than it was in 1914 because there are nuclear weapons. The core countries and some non-core countries like Israel, for example, and North Korea have nuclear weapons. And so the prospect of nuclear holocaust is something that's frightening for a lot of people. So the question is, what solution is there? And clearly, diplomacy and mutual cooperation for the mutual benefit of countries rather than the uneven development that has been taking place from imperialism to neoliberalism is a solution. I thank you for listening, and I wish everyone a good evening. And until next time, thank you very much.